I got the call at 11:47 p.m. on the worst day of the year. Madison's name flashed on my phone screen, and for a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. It was exactly 1 year since we buried Sarah, and I'd just gotten home from the memorial dinner. But it was Madison, Sarah's best friend since college, the woman who held Sarah's hand through chemo when I couldn't bear to watch. I couldn't ignore her call. When I picked up, her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying. She told me her kitchen sink had burst and water was everywhere. She said she'd flooded the apartment downstairs and the neighbors were furious. She knew it was late, but I was the only person she trusted to fix it. I asked how bad it was. She said really bad. She tried calling emergency plumbing services, but they wanted $300 just to come out tonight. I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes. She asked if I was sure, saying she knew today was hard for me. I said I was sure, and told her to try to stop as much water as she could until I got there. Let me explain how I got to this point. My name is David, I'm 40 years old, and I used to own a custom furniture business. Had a nice workshop, steady clients, made beautiful things with my hands. Sarah loved watching me work. She'd sit in the garage while I sanded and shaped wood, bringing me coffee and talking about her day. That life ended when Sarah got sick. Stage 4 ovarian cancer came out of nowhere. I sold half my tools to pay for treatments that didn't work. After she died, I couldn't focus anymore. My hands would shake when I tried to work, so now I do handyman work. Fix sinks, repair drywall, hang pictures. Simple work that doesn't require much thought. Perfect for a guy whose brain hasn't worked right since his wife died. My 8-year-old daughter Emily lives with my parents most of the time. We all agreed it was better this way while I got my head straight. Some days I feel like I'm getting better. Other days I feel like I'm drowning in grief. Today had been a drowning day from the moment I woke up. The memorial dinner was my idea, though I regretted it almost immediately. Madison came wearing a black dress that made her look pale and tired. She brought Sarah's favorite red velvet cake and talked about college memories, but I could tell she was struggling too. She left early, around 8:30, saying she had a headache. Madison lived in one of those new apartment complexes on the nice side of town. I pulled up with my toolbox in the back of my truck, feeling out of place among all the luxury cars. She was waiting for me in the lobby, wearing jeans and an old college sweatshirt. No makeup, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked younger like this, more like the woman I remembered from Sarah's wedding 15 years ago. She thanked me for coming and said she knew tonight was hard for me. I told her it was hard for both of us. Her apartment was complete chaos. The kitchen floor was covered in soaked towels. Water dripped from the ceiling light fixture. The cabinet under the sink was wide open, revealing twisted pipes and a steady stream of water pouring onto the floor. I asked how long this had been going on. She said about 2 hours. She'd been washing dishes from the cake pan, and suddenly everything just exploded. I set down my toolbox and surveyed the damage. Someone had done a terrible repair job years ago. The pipes were old, the fittings were cheap, and everything was corroded. I asked if she'd talked to the neighbors downstairs. She said Mrs. Chen was furious about water pouring through her ceiling. Mr. Rodriguez had offered to help, but what could a 75-year-old man do? I got under the sink with my flashlight. The main pipe had burst at a joint where someone had used the wrong kind of coupling. This wasn't a simple fix. I told her I needed to shut off the water first, then figure out what parts I needed to replace. The water shut-off valve was stuck. I had to use pliers and put my full body weight behind it to get it moving. Madison asked if she could get me anything, coffee, water, something stronger. I said I was okay and suggested she start getting the towels into the washing machine. After examining everything, I told her the bad news. I needed a new coupling, pipe tape, and probably a whole new section of pipe. Nothing was open except the 24-hour Home Depot across town. Madison looked like she might cry. She said the neighbors were threatening to call their insurance company. I told her I'd go get the parts. It would take about an hour round trip. She said she couldn't ask me to drive across town at 1 in the morning. I told her she wasn't asking, I was offering. Besides, I wasn't going to leave a job half finished. She asked why I was being so nice to her when I could just tell her to call a real plumber tomorrow. I looked at Madison, really looked at her, and saw she wasn't just upset about the sink. She was falling apart, the same way I'd been falling apart. I told her it was because she was there. When Sarah was dying, when I couldn't handle watching her suffer, Madison was there. She held Sarah's hand during chemo when I was throwing up from stress. She was stronger than I was. Madison's eyes filled with tears. She said she wasn't stronger, just better at hiding how scared she was. I said either way, she was there when it mattered, so now I was here. The drive to Home Depot gave me time to think. I'd known Madison for 15 years, but we'd never spent time alone together. She was always Sarah's friend, part of the background, but tonight felt different. There was something fragile about her that I hadn't noticed before. The store was nearly empty, just me, a few night shift workers, and some college kids buying beer. I found the plumbing section and grabbed what I needed. The kid at checkout asked if it was a rough night. I said something like that. He said his dad always told him plumbing problems happened at the worst possible times. I told him his dad sounded like a smart man. By the time I got back, Madison had cleaned up most of the water. She'd also changed into a soft gray sweater that made her eyes look bigger. I asked how the neighbors were. She said Mrs. Chen had calmed down when she explained I was fixing it tonight. Mr. Rodriguez had even brought up a bottle of wine as a thank you. The repair was more complicated than expected. The old pipe was so corroded that removing it required cutting through metal that had fused together. By the time I got everything apart, it was past 2 in the morning. Madison sat at her kitchen table while I worked, nursing a glass of wine. When I was testing the new fittings, she said Sarah used to tell her that my workshop was like a church to me. I stopped what I was doing. Nobody had mentioned Sarah's specific words to me in months. I asked if she really said that. Madison said all the time. Sarah would tell her how peaceful I looked when I was building something. I told her I hadn't been in the workshop since Sarah died. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. She asked why not. I explained that the last thing I was working on was a cradle. We'd been trying to have another baby. When Sarah got sick, I never finished it. It was still sitting there, half-built. Madison was quiet for a moment. She said that sounded incredibly painful. I agreed. But so was everything else these days. She asked if I'd ever thought about finishing it. Not for the baby we'd never have, but for the love that created it. I finished the repair and turned the water back on. Everything held, no leaks. Madison tested the faucet and thanked me. She said she didn't know what she would have done if I hadn't come. I told her she would have figured something out. She was stronger than she thought. She asked if she really was, because most days she felt like she was barely holding it together. Something in her voice made me look at her more carefully. This was the look of someone who'd been struggling for a long time. I asked if she was okay, beyond the sink situation. She poured herself another glass of wine and offered me one. I accepted. She said today had been really hard. The dinner, seeing everyone, talking about Sarah like she was really gone forever. Sometimes she still expected Sarah to call her about something ridiculous. I said I still set 2 coffee cups out every morning before I remembered. She asked if I really did, saying that must be awful. I told her some mornings it was. Other mornings I just put the second cup back and tried not to think about it. She asked how I did it, how I got up every morning knowing Sarah wasn't coming back. It was the most direct question anyone had asked me since the funeral. Usually people offered platitudes. Madison was asking me to explain something I didn't understand myself. I told her honestly that some days I didn't get up. Some days I lay in bed until Emily called, and then I pretended to be okay for her sake. She asked about the other days. I said other days I fixed people's sinks and pretended that staying busy was the same thing as healing. Madison laughed, a real laugh that transformed her whole face. She said that was very zen of me. I said not really. It was just easier than thinking about the alternative. She asked what the alternative was. I said, admitting that I had no idea how to live without Sarah. We sat there drinking wine and talking about Sarah, about the way she'd hum off key in the shower, about her terrible sense of direction, about how she'd get excited about small things, a good parking spot, finding money in old jacket pockets. Madison said Sarah had this theory that happiness wasn't one big thing. It was tiny moments you had to pay attention to, or you'd miss them. I said I remembered that. Sarah used to say it was like collecting coins. Individually, they didn't seem like much, but eventually you had something valuable. Madison asked if I still collected moments like that. I said I tried to, mostly for Emily's sake, but it was hard when everything reminded me of what was missing. She asked for an example. I told her about making pancakes on Sunday mornings. Sarah always insisted on doing them from scratch. She said the ritual was half the point. Madison asked if I still made them from scratch. I said no, I bought frozen ones. Emily didn't complain, but I knew it wasn't the same. Madison was quiet, considering this. She said maybe that was okay. Maybe some traditions didn't survive, and that wasn't a failure. It was just evolution. I looked at Madison across the table. I told her she was different than I thought she was. She asked different how. I said wiser, more thoughtful. When she was Sarah's friend, she always seemed so light, like nothing bothered her. She said that was mostly an act. Sarah was the one with real lightness. Madison just tried to match her energy because it made her feel better about her own darkness. I asked what kind of darkness. Madison hesitated. She said she'd struggled with depression since college. Not the kind that kept you in bed, but the kind that made everything feel muted. Sarah knew about it, but never made her feel broken. I said Sarah was good at making people feel accepted. Madison agreed. She said losing Sarah had been like losing the person who helped her remember that life could be bright. The honesty was stunning. Here was Madison, who I'd always thought of as confident and put together, telling me she'd been struggling with the same darkness that consumed me. I asked if that was why she called me tonight. Because she needed someone who understood. She said partly, but also because she trusted me. Because I knew Sarah the way she knew Sarah. Because I was one of the few people who didn't try to tell her everything happened for a reason. I asked if she believed that Sarah was in a better place. Madison shrugged and said some days. Other days she thought Sarah was just gone and we were left trying to figure out how to live with the hole she left behind. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. It was almost 3 in the morning, but I felt more awake than I had in months. I asked if I could ask her something. She said sure. I asked why she really called me tonight. She could have waited until morning. She could have called any plumber. Why me, at midnight, on today of all days? She looked down at her hands wrapped around her wine glass. She said because she didn't want to be alone tonight. Because she knew I'd come. Because she'd been thinking about me a lot lately, and she wasn't sure if that was okay. I asked what she meant by thinking about me. She said wondering how I was doing when I thought no one was watching. Wondering if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, taking care of myself. Wondering if I was as lonely as she was. My heart started beating faster. I asked if she was lonely. She said desperately. She had friends, work, a full life on paper, but she didn't have anyone who really knew her anymore. Sarah was the person she called when something good happened, when something bad happened, when nothing happened but she just wanted to talk. I said I knew the feeling. She said she was worried about me tonight. At the dinner I looked so lost, like I was physically there but emotionally somewhere else entirely. I said that was pretty much how I felt most of the time these days. She said that's what scared her. Sarah had made her promise to look out for me, and she felt like she'd been failing at that. I asked if Sarah had asked her to look out for me. Madison said right after Sarah's diagnosis. They were sitting in the hospital waiting room while I was talking to the oncologist. Sarah grabbed her hand and said to promise she'd check on me, that I was going to try to handle this alone, and I couldn't. I felt something twist in my chest. I said Sarah never told me that. Madison said Sarah didn't want me to feel like she was giving up hope. But she was practical about worst-case scenarios. She made lists, gave instructions, tried to prepare for things she hoped would never happen. I asked what other instructions Sarah had given her. Madison smiled through her tears. She said Sarah told her to make sure I kept eating real food, not just cereal and takeout. She told her to remind me to call Emily every day, even when I didn't feel like talking. She told her to help me figure out what to do with Sarah's clothes when I was ready. I said I still hadn't gone through Sarah's clothes. Madison said she knew. She'd looked in on the house a few months ago when I was at work. Everything in my bedroom was exactly the same as when Sarah died. I asked if she'd gone in my house. She said I'd given her a key, remember? Right after the funeral when I wasn't thinking clearly. I'd said she should feel free to get anything of Sarah's that she wanted to keep. I did remember that vaguely. The weeks after Sarah died were a blur of casseroles and condolence cards, and people making decisions for me because I couldn't make them myself. I asked if she'd taken anything. She said a few books. The sweater Sarah wore to Madison's birthday party last year. The coffee mug she always used when she came to visit. I said good. I was glad she had those things. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts about Sarah and grief and the strange intimacy of sharing pain with someone who truly understood. I said I wanted to tell her something I'd never told anyone else. She said, of course. I said sometimes I was angry at Sarah for dying. Not at the cancer, not at God, not at the unfairness of life. Angry at her specifically for leaving me to figure out how to live without her. Madison nodded like this made perfect sense. She said she was angry at Sarah too sometimes, for not fighting harder, for accepting the diagnosis so quickly, for spending her last months preparing us for her death instead of fighting to stay alive. I asked if she felt guilty about being angry. She said constantly. But her therapist said anger was just grief wearing a different mask, that it was normal to feel abandoned by someone who didn't choose to leave but left anyway. I said her therapist sounded smarter than mine. She asked if I was seeing someone. I explained it was court-ordered, part of the custody arrangement with Emily. My parents were worried about my mental state, so they insisted on a psychological evaluation before Emily could come back to live with me full-time. She asked what my therapist said about my mental state. I said that I was depressed, but functional, that I was grieving normally, that I needed to rebuild my support network and find new sources of meaning and connection. I made air quotes around the clinical language. Madison laughed and said they all sounded the same, didn't they? Hers told her she needed to process her loss and develop healthy coping mechanisms for managing her grief. I asked if she had developed healthy coping mechanisms. She asked if calling me at midnight to fix her sink counted as healthy. I said probably not. But it worked, didn't it? She wasn't alone, her sink was fixed, and we were having the most honest conversation I'd had in months. Madison looked at me across the table and something shifted in her expression. She said she needed to tell me something. I said okay. She said this wasn't really about the sink. I raised an eyebrow and asked what she meant. She said yes, the pipe burst and she did need it fixed, but she could have waited until morning. She could have called someone else. She called me because she wanted to see me, because she'd been thinking about me, and not just in a checking on Sarah's widower kind of way. My stomach dropped. I said her name. She said she knew this was complicated. She knew the timing was terrible. She knew Sarah was her best friend, and I was Sarah's husband. But she couldn't pretend anymore that she didn't have feelings for me. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I stared at her, this woman I'd known for years but was seeing clearly for the first time. I asked what kind of feelings. She said the kind where she drove by my house sometimes just to see if my lights were on, the kind where she bought 2 coffees out of habit, then remembered I wasn't there to drink the second one, the kind where she called me at midnight about a broken sink because she couldn't think of any other excuse to see me. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I told her I didn't know what to say. She said I didn't have to say anything. She just needed me to know. She needed to stop pretending that this was just about friendship or keeping promises to Sarah. I said, but it was about Sarah, wasn't it? I mean, she was the reason we knew each other. Madison said Sarah was the reason we met, but she wasn't the reason Madison had feelings for me now. I stood up from the table and walked to her kitchen window. The city looked different at night, softer somehow, less demanding. I said this was crazy. It had been 1 year since Sarah died. She said she knew. I said people would think we were terrible, that we didn't love her enough to mourn properly. She asked if I cared what people thought. I turned around to look at her. I said I cared what Emily thought. I cared what my parents thought. I cared what Sarah would think. Madison stood up too and came over to where I was standing. She asked what I thought Sarah would think. I said I honestly didn't know. We never talked about what would happen if one of us died. We were too young, too healthy, too convinced we had decades left together. She said, but knowing Sarah, knowing how much she loved me, what did I think she'd want for me? I thought about Sarah, about her fierce love for the people she cared about how she used to worry that I worked too much, isolated myself too much, didn't have enough close friendships outside of our marriage. I said quietly that she'd want me to be happy. She'd want me to take care of Emily and myself. She'd want me to build a life that honored what we had without being trapped by it. Madison asked if I thought Sarah would want that life to include someone who loved her as much as Madison did. Someone who understood what I'd lost because they lost it too. I looked at Madison, really looked at her, at the way she was standing close enough that I could smell her shampoo, at the hope and fear written across her face, at the vulnerability in her eyes that told me this conversation was as scary for her as it was for me. I said I didn't know, but I knew that I cared about her, more than I probably should, more than I expected to. She asked why this felt so hard then. I said because Sarah had only been gone a year, because I still talked to her picture every morning when I was getting dressed, because I didn't know how to love someone new without feeling like I was cheating on a ghost. Madison stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. She said maybe that wasn't what this was. Maybe this was just 2 people who missed the same person finding comfort in each other. I asked if that was what she wanted. Comfort. She said she wanted me to stay tonight. She wanted to fall asleep next to someone who understood why she still cried in the grocery store when she saw a red velvet cake mix. She wanted to wake up tomorrow and not regret this conversation. The smart thing would have been to leave, to thank her for the wine, grab my toolbox, and drive home to my empty house. To keep our relationship simple, uncomplicated by feelings and possibilities, and the messy reality of two grieving people reaching for each other in the dark. Instead, I kissed her. It was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. Madison kissed me back, her hands coming up to rest on my chest. When we broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads touching. She whispered if we were crazy. I said probably. She asked if I cared. I said not tonight. She took my hand and led me to her bedroom. We didn't talk about what this meant or where it was going. We just held each other in the dark, two people who'd lost the same important person finding something unexpected in their shared grief. I woke up the next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon. Madison was in the kitchen, still wearing my t-shirt from the night before, hair messy from sleep. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway, suddenly shy. She said good morning and that she'd made breakfast. She hoped that was okay. She wasn't sure if I'd want to rush out or stay. I said it was more than okay. We ate in comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through her windows, making everything look soft and possible. Everything felt different in daylight. Not wrong exactly, but more real, more consequential. I said I should probably get going soon. Emily was coming home that afternoon. Madison nodded and said, of course. I told her that last night wasn't a mistake, at least not for me. She smiled, relief flooding her face. She said good, because she was terrified I'd wake up and regret everything. I said the only thing I regretted was that it took a plumbing emergency to get us here. She said maybe that's how all the best things start, with broken pipes and midnight phone calls. I kissed her goodbye at the door, longer this time, more certain. I asked if I could call her later. She said she hoped so. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year, possibility. Not happiness exactly, but the idea that happiness might be possible again someday. That afternoon, Emily and I made pancakes from scratch and talked about her school project. She was building a model solar system. While we were painting Jupiter, she said I seemed different today. I asked different how. She said less sad. Still sad, but less. Like maybe I'd remembered how to smile again. I said maybe I had remembered, a little bit. She asked if it was because I'd helped Madison last night. I asked how she knew about that. She said Grandma told her Madison had called me to fix her sink. I confirmed that I had fixed her sink. She asked if that made me feel better. I said yeah, it did. She nodded like this made perfect sense. She said Mom would like that I helped Madison because they were best friends. I asked what made her say that. She said because Mom always told her the most important thing was taking care of the people you love. And Madison loved Mom, so Mom would want us to take care of her too, out of the mouths of babes. That evening, after Emily went to bed, I called Madison. We talked for 2 hours about nothing important, her work, my plans for the week, a movie she wanted to see. I told her I kept waiting for the guilt to hit. She asked if I did feel bad. I said no, and asked if I should. She said she didn't think so. She thought Sarah would want us both to be happy. I asked even together. She said especially together. Sarah knew us both better than anyone. If there was something here worth finding, she probably saw it before we did. Over the next few weeks, Madison and I started seeing each other regularly. Not dates exactly. We were both too scared to call them that. But dinners at her place, walks around the neighborhood, quiet evenings on her couch. Emily noticed the change in me immediately. I was sleeping better, eating more, actually laughing at her jokes. When I told her I'd been spending time with Madison, she just shrugged and said, good, I needed friends. Madison started coming to the house sometimes, while I worked in the garage. I'd finally opened the workshop door, started tinkering with small projects again. A jewelry box for Emily, a picture frame for Madison's desk. The work felt good in my hands again. One evening, Madison was watching me sand a table leg when she said Sarah always said I was most myself when I was creating something. I said Sarah was right. Madison said Sarah also told her I'd find my way back to it eventually. I asked if Sarah had said anything else about my future. Madison smiled and said Sarah told her I had too much love in me to stay alone forever. She just hoped whoever found me would be worthy of what I had to offer. I asked what Madison thought, if she was worthy of what I had to offer. She said she was trying to be, every day. 2 months after the night of the broken sink, Madison stayed over when Emily was in the house. We were careful. She slept in the guest room, and we acted like friends around Emily. But something had shifted. Emily saw right through our charade. One morning, while Madison was making coffee, Emily asked if Madison and I were going to get married. I nearly choked on my cereal and said that was complicated. She asked if it was because of Mom. I said partly. She asked if I thought Mom would be mad. I said I didn't think so. I thought Mom would want us to be happy. Emily asked if I was happy. I said I was getting there. She said then she thought it was okay. Later that day, Madison and I talked about the future. We were sitting on my back porch, watching Emily play in the yard. She asked what we were doing. I said I didn't know and asked what she wanted to be doing. She said she wanted to stop pretending this was temporary. She wanted to stop sleeping in the guest room. She wanted to tell people we were together. I asked about Sarah. Madison was quiet, watching Emily chase a butterfly. She asked if I remembered what Sarah said at our wedding, in her maid of honor speech. I said she'd never seen me as happy as I was with Madison. Madison said Sarah also said that love wasn't a finite resource. The more you give, the more you have to give. I asked what it meant to her. She said it meant that loving me didn't diminish what she felt for Sarah, and loving her didn't diminish what I felt for Sarah. Love multiplies. It doesn't divide. That night, Madison didn't sleep in the guest room.